Hey everyone, professional photographer Ian Plant here, and today we are talking with one of my favorite photographers. And we've had her on the program before. I'm sure we will have her on many times. Please welcome the exceptionally talented Sarah Marino. Sarah, welcome to Photomasters Live.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be having this conversation with you.
Always a pleasure talking with you and seeing your new work. So what have you been up to lately?
Oh, well, we have been very focused on the Mojave Desert. We're working on a book project. So Death Valley National Park's 30th anniversary is next year, late next year. So since that's one of our favorite places, and when I say our, I'm also referring to my husband, who's isn't a full-time nature photographer in the professional sense, but he is in the practical sense. So Ron Coscaroso, he and I are working together on this book project in celebration of Death Valley's 30th anniversary as a national park. So we started the year in Death Valley, ended the year in Death Valley, and have done other things in between. Like today, we're going to be talking about my experience in Alaska. This was our first trip to Alaska for the goal was to extend fall colors as long as possible. So starting in the far north and then ending in the southwest US. So that's pretty much what I've been up to lately is just as much fall color photography as possible. I just actually photographed some fall colors outside of Death Valley. So still going at least here in the southern part of the US.
Well, we've got a comment from Jim who says that your ebook, Beyond the Grand Landscape, is his Bible. That's always a nice compliment to get.
Yeah, that's so nice, Jim. You may be happy to know that I am hard at work on a fully revised second edition. So that should come out depending on how much more fun I have. I keep on going and doing fun trips instead of working. So we just went to Death Valley for a week and a half. So I'm even more delayed on that project. But hopefully, sometime in the new year, early in the new year, we'll have a fully revised second edition of that.
So I hear that Death Valley is pretty much underwater right now. There's a lot of flooding. There's been a lot of flooding for the past few months, and there's even a lot of roads that are closed.
Yeah, that's definitely been the case. Even for the last couple of years, there have been a couple of really significant storms to come through the park. This last storm, Hurricane Hillary, happened in August, and the park, I believe, was closed until maybe October 15th or somewhere. Don't count me on the specific date, but sometime in October. And many of the backcountry roads never reopened after the flooding the previous year. So now it seems like they're trying to actually more permanently fix the roads. But yes, in terms of photography, the reason that we went out to Death Valley was because of Lake Manley. So Lake Manley is the ancient lake that filled the entire Badwater Basin area. And Hurricane Hillary brought that lake back. So it's essentially a very shallow ephemeral lake right now. From Dante's View, which is the high view where you're about 5,000-ish feet looking down into Badwater Basin, the water is this beautiful turquoise bluish green color. So that was absolutely fantastic at sunrise. And then from actually down in Badwater Basin, you can walk out into the water and be standing in 3 to 4 inches of water with a full reflection of the Panamint Mountains on the west side and the Black Mountains on the east side, just reflecting in this body of water around you. So it's a pretty special experience for a very dry place like Death Valley.
Well, so we're getting some questions about that. Bill asks whether you think that Lake Manley will still be around in February.
The park says they have no idea how long it will last. It's massive right now, so it's still filling a huge section of Badwater Basin. So there's a chance. I definitely think it will last through at least the end of this month, maybe into January. So, but it's going to shrink, and there'll still, as it goes away, there'll still be small sections until it's fully dried up. So at this point, it's possible.
Yeah, you never can tell with nature. We got a question from Danelle who asks whether your revised Beyond the Grand Landscape will be significant because she's thinking of taking a look at it, the current version, and wants to know whether she should wait for the new version.
I would say you should wait for the new version, fully revised. Like I'm rewriting almost every single word. So it will be a workbook, like actually putting the ideas into practice of 6 videos and then the actual ebook itself. So it's more of a course this time than just an ebook. So I'd say, yeah, it's worth waiting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as photographers and artists, we're constantly rethinking our approach to things. I know, like the earlier edition of some of my ebooks, like my composition book, Visual Flow, compared to the most recent edition, they were only a few years apart, but there was just a huge change in the way I approach photography. So I'm guessing that Beyond the Grand Landscape version 2 is going to have a lot of new significant thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think the first one, it's more the roots of kind of my photographic practice, and now it's just a significant evolution. I also think I just know how to describe these things a little bit better. I know how to talk about my photography more eloquently now than I think I did back when we did the original version. So yeah, I would agree. Like the distance between the first version and this one is more significant than your visual flow example. But yeah, it's I think it's good to feel like I'm progressing still, like I have fresh ideas. Maybe too many fresh ideas because it's getting really long, but
Well, fresh ideas are never a bad thing. And so I think it's fair to say that recently your photography took another evolutionary step and you kind of branched out and started to try something that you hadn't really done before, which is some wildlife photography during your Alaska trip. Tell us more about that experience. And I'm going to go into some of your photos that we can talk about.
Yeah. So I think that the main thing that I've seen in terms of my own photography over the last couple of years is I keep on coming back to this idea of the expansive mindset. Like, I want to see more opportunities when I'm outside. I want to work with more diverse types of light. I want to have those skills. I want to see more compositional options. I want to be more inspired. I don't want to just be counting on the best conditions or epic light to feel satisfied. So I want to find a full range of opportunities to photograph when I'm out in the natural world. So I think that idea and just learning more about naturalist practices and actually becoming more educated about nature in the places that I visit, I think all of those things have come together to say, like, the wildlife and birds is a very natural extension of that idea. So I still very much consider myself a nature and landscape photographer, but I also feel like now I'm at least developing some skills to take advantage of some of those. Like, if I encounter wildlife, I now know what to do. I now know what settings to use. I have a better sense of how to capture action because I am so slow and deliberate when I'm photographing nature and landscape scenes generally. And this is so like an entirely different way of thinking about photography. So I think just broadening my skills to the point where I can be much more adaptable and much more reactive. And I think that will also probably help when I'm working with landscapes. If there's some incredible ephemeral light in front of me, I think I can react much more quickly than maybe I was able to 6 months ago. So I think that that's probably kind of the overall synopsis is I'm continuing to expand my practice to include more things. And so wildlife photography and bird photography is the natural extension. It doesn't mean I'm good at it yet, but it definitely feels like it's fulfilling and exciting. So I think that's the bottom line.
Well, so I'm curious to know your thoughts. What you thought was different about the way you approached wildlife that is a change for you compared to the small scenes, intimates, and landscape photography you've done in the past.
Well, I think the number one thing is that you can have so you can we don't have any control over our subjects generally as nature and landscape photographers. Um, but when I'm working with a small scene that's not moving and it's literally at my feet, I can stand and work with a composition, refining. I can have that idea, be excited about something, test a couple of different framing options, refine a composition fully, spend 25 minutes, 30 minutes working on a single photograph. That is pretty much opposite of an animal that you have even less control over the subject, where uh, you might have mere seconds to react. So I think the idea of actually spending mere seconds with a subject is incredibly stressful in some ways, but it's also exciting. So I think that that's probably the piece where I feel like over time, if I continue doing working with wildlife and birds a little bit more intentionally, that's the thing I need to work on the most. Like, I don't stick with the action long enough. Like, I'll if something is happening, some kind of interesting behavior, the first phase of that behavior, I have learned in assessing my strengths and weaknesses, that first burst of action, I'll photograph through that. And then I'll be like, wow, that was great. And then realize that something still very interesting is happening and I've just missed it. Um, because I think I'm just used to working on that one thing in front of me being done and then moving on to the next idea. And so I think it's been hard to like that stick with the action piece. Since you do both, like what are some of your reflections on like how your landscape and wildlife work mix or don't mix or benefit each other? Like how do you think about this dynamic?
That's a really great question, and I've always believed that trying a genre that's different from what you typically do is great for artistic development. It forces one to learn to see the world in a new way, and I really feel there are crossover benefits. But I also feel that with a lot of my wildlife photography, I think of my wildlife the way I think of landscape photography. I like doing wide angles with my wildlife. I like bringing in interesting light and weather into my wildlife compositions. So I find that I kind of approach wildlife much more like a landscape photographer would think about things. And I've always felt that most wildlife photography is actually much more similar to the intimate type of photography that you often prefer to do. And so to me, it seems like a much more natural crossover. And so I can imagine you approaching your wildlife subjects in a very similar way uh, to the ways you approach your intimate subjects. Because a lot of times it is the art of exclusion. You're zooming in with a longer focal length and excluding a lot of extraneous information and just focusing the viewer on a single subject or a few bare essential elements. And that's always been the kind of photography that I've personally struggled with. I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to me. I like working with complex wide angle scenes, but when it gets to like the more essential scenes, I kind of struggle to find that perfect balance of essential elements. And some wildlife photography, I think, has got me thinking more about that sort of thing. So I was recently in Antarctica, and that was a lot of intimate landscapes and a lot of longer lens wildlife. I wasn't able to do the wide angle stuff that I normally do. And I felt myself often, asking myself as I'm approaching these scenes, what would Sarah do in this situation?
And what did my voice tell you to do?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I thought it'd be funny to say, what would Sarah, I actually did to say to myself, gee, this is the kind of thing that Sarah would really enjoy. I should think about approaching this the way she would. But I'm afraid that your approach comes a little counterintuitively to me. It doesn't come naturally. So I was struggling to hear your voice. So I need you to be the voice now and tell me what to do.
Do you think it was the lack of complexity, like that having just a photograph that's just about a single idea instead of maybe a central idea, but then some additional secondary concepts, which is what I think a lot of your grand landscapes encompass? Like, do
Yeah.
you think that might have been one of the roots, like that having just that single, like let's say an iceberg
Right.
floating in the sea with clouds, like that's a pretty central, like single idea,
Yeah.
or water reflections on the surface, or abstract patterns in an iceberg. Like those are, I'm assuming, some of the concepts that you might have been working with.
Right.
But those are all kind of like that's one central idea, and that's kind of like the obvious message behind a photograph like that. Versus some of your grand landscapes where I think they're probably a little bit more layered in terms of the compositional idea than what I do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I look for visual juxtaposition and visual opposition, and I think you've got images that rely more on harmony, maybe. So tell me more about this photo. This is the kind of photo that I might personally struggle with.
Okay. So I think your point that you mentioned around the idea of harmony, or like that you're looking for visual juxtaposition. I think I do the opposite of that almost very consistently. So the idea for me with most of my photographs is that I'm looking for things like ideas like exclusion, simplification, a focus on the details and eliminating as many visual distractions as possible. And that's the thought process that I'm going through whenever I'm creating a composition. So with that particular photo of the ice, the I usually don't like having that focus point. And the oak leaf that's frozen, that's I did not place that. It is frozen in the ice. So it was perfectly placed in the middle or in that circle. But like this is something I don't necessarily do because I like if one of the compositional ideas that a lot of people talk about is visual hierarchy, where your composition is organized so that you're drawing attention to something, letting the viewer know that that's the primary focal point or the primary subject. I generally tend to what I call visual equality, where almost everything in the composition is equally important. So for this particular photo, this is almost as close to visual hierarchy as I get, where the leaf in the circle immediately draws your attention, but then the rest of the scene is fairly balanced. So yes, there are lines that are flowing from left to right generally. There's some repetition in the little circles, some repetition in the lines, so that those are my more traditional or more typical the compositional things that I would generally go for. Uh, but in this particular case, the oak leaf does provide a little bit of like, look at me energy, which I don't usually have in my photography. So I think we just take such different approaches.
Yeah, and I think this is a fantastic image. And what I love about it is that it is very complex. Just love the way it all comes together. And I kind of wonder if this is the sort of thing that I would see myself if I were shooting.
Yeah, so this, I guess, would be a very similar example of the same theme, where we have a lot of repetition. But this composition, I think, is more layered in the sense that, yeah, the leaf is a focal point, but then we have there are all the little repeating terraces, and then there's the color contrast, so the blue versus the gold, and then there's also ice, so that adds a little bit of texture, and then there's reflected light on the edges. So I think that this photo I think would be a little bit more visually complex than a lot of my other work, but it's still a lot of the same ideas. So I'm constantly going back to the idea of repetition, again simplification that I'm looking those are some of the ideas that I'm using to take the chaos of nature. So there's so much chaos going on around us. And then those are the things that I'm using to simplify, where I think you just knowing your photography for years, that when I look at your photography, you're more leaning into the chaos, whereas I'm trying to eliminate it to the greatest degree possible. I think I'm trying to move a little bit more in the direction of working with a little bit more complexity in terms of the compositions that I work on. But I think that last two photos that you showed, I think those are examples of where I feel most excited when I'm out in nature. Like I love coming across these kinds of little scenes where it's just like the fact that there's this little bit of beauty in this otherwise incredibly chaotic. This is a riparian area in Zion National Park that if you're standing in it, it's like there's just so much going on that I feel visually overwhelmed. But then when I see a little detail like this, then I feel excited and I feel I want to exclude it and make the message just about the fact that this little scene is full of beauty and I feel like it's just as worthy as the big chaotic canyon that I'm standing in. So I think that's a little bit of the thought process that for me goes into the composition and the connection piece with a photo like this.
Yeah, I mean, these are both complex photos. They're not simple at all. I think there is a fair amount of visual chaos, and you have done a really great job at arranging the elements. And I love the warm cool here. I think that is very effective. And we have a question that has come in from Bob, who wants to know about winter photography tips. So, tips on cold weather, clothing, and gear, and tips for photographing in snow and cold. I just did a webinar on winter photography that talked about all of these things. So for anyone who missed that, you can go to the Photomaster store and you can buy the digital download of the replay video. But Sarah, do you have any cold weather tips? Just maybe a few minutes worth that kind of summarize your approach to winter photography.
Yeah. So this photo and the last photo that Ian just showed, we took these in Zion National Park last year. So not we were there this year, but it was very warm this year, versus last year where it was just like crazy cold every day, and I don't do well in the cold. So I think my number one tip is invest in really, really comfortable, good quality, warm clothing, especially if you're somebody like me that gets very cold. Because if you're not comfortable, you're not going to have the energy to focus on photography. So, photography, from my perspective, it's a challenging endeavor that requires a lot of mental focus and attention. And if I'm thinking about the fact that my feet are cold and I want to go back to the car, then I'm not going to have the mental attention to devote to actually photographing. So this means things like really high quality winter boots, multiple layers with a windproof outer layer. So windproof pants, a windproof shell. I invested in a top quality down coat a year ago, and it's been an absolute game changer for me. I think the thing that I'm probably going to add to my own kit is some heated gloves, because touching a hot or a cold tripod just like saps the energy out of my hands. So I think that's probably one thing that I'm going to do sooner rather than later. But overall, like the dressing in layers. So if you're walking, you can, and expending energy and getting warmer, you can uh, go down to just a couple of layers so that you're more comfortable when you're walking. You don't get sweaty and then cold when you stop. And then once you're actually starting to be more stationary with your photography, then you have layers to put back on so that you can stay warm, so that you can adapt based on whatever the conditions are that you're working with. Um, so I think that's probably the thing that's been most important for me to do winter photography, is just being comfortable. The coldest I've been in was -25 in the Tetons. And for me to be able to be outside almost the entire day photographing, like that means it's possible for anybody to find the right combination of gear. If I can find it and be comfortable, you can find it. It's just expensive and like trial and error to figure out what works. So I think that would be my one single recommendation, is invest in the good clothes. Yeah, so these photos, like this particular one, this was from a very cold morning in Death Valley National Park. So those patterns are more from like a freeze thaw type cycle. So this was after a flood had come through the park and left behind a lot of wet mud, and then it got very cold. So those fractures formed during a cold overnight. I don't know that it, like the mud got down to like a super like solid state, but anyway, those colder temperatures had something to do with that situation. And then this is the same exact type of idea, where this composition for me is all about repetition. And then I'm thinking about the in terms of some more dynamism, like that there's a little something going on in the upper left corner, there's a little something going on in the lower right, and that provides a little bit more visual dynamism to this composition, compared to like if I had just focused on like the center of the composition where it was just the lines, that then I don't think it would necessarily have quite as much visual nuance. So for this particular one, I did like that. Ian, you were talking about using juxtaposition a lot. This might not be a huge juxtaposition, but just a little bit of a difference in texture, and then having it at a diagonal that takes the idea of repetition and adds one more layer. This would be another example of, so Death Valley National Park, mud tiles after the flood 2 years or 1 year ago. And it's the same idea of just, first of all, paying attention. Second of all, getting out of your car and exploring. And then looking for these kinds of little details amidst a very chaotic type of situation. So in both of these cases, these little scenes were surrounded by creosote bushes, which are anywhere from 5 to 10 feet tall bushes that grow in the Mojave Desert. There's sand and rocks and other things. So it's about taking in the full scene, thinking about what resonates with me, and then really focusing on exclusion. So, and composing for the edges. So if something's interesting in the middle, but it's also really important how all of those lines enter and exit each side of the frame. So I think those would be some of the core ideas that I'm using when I'm approaching a smaller scene like this. With this one, we have a Death Valley theme going on for sure, which I guess makes sense because I absolutely love Death Valley National Park. It's definitely my favorite place to photograph nature. So this is I find this type of scene kind of surprising when you think of Death Valley National Park. It's a place that I think a lot of people think of as very brown. So that's the color. If you visit during the middle of the day, brown is the color that comes through. That's the message that's imprinted on your mind. But if you find a scene like this that's both colorful, so the mud is actually pink, and then you photograph it at the fringes of the day, you're going to get beautiful, cool, and cooler tones like pastels and bluer shadows, and so that you can present this is Death Valley National Park, and it doesn't fit that preconception of this is a brown, desolate place. Well, it's actually incredibly colorful. You just have to see it at the right times of day. So, but the composition here is all very similar to a lot of the ideas that I've been talking about. So repetition, uh, organized around the key idea. And the key idea here I would see as being these really beautiful ripples and then repeating diagonal lines. Uh, I think the thing that sparked my attention was just the beautiful light and the beautiful colors and the fact that it was kind of a surprising subject for a place like Death Valley. So those are a couple of ideas that went into this. On the technical side, a lot of these photos that Ian has just showed wouldn't have been very easy a couple of years ago because they're all long focus stacks. So I'm using a pretty long lens pointed diagonally at the ground and then focus stacking. So I'm currently using the Canon R5, which has an autofocus bracketing feature, and being able to get very precise layers of bands of focus and then blending them later in software. This is a benefit of modern camera equipment is you're able to do that. Whereas doing something like this before with a digital camera, you could still achieve this kind of focus. It would be prone to error, but with the new camera equipment, something like this is pretty straightforward. So in this case, it's like seeing the opportunity and then knowing that you have the technical skills to then know that this is what I have to do to get everything in focus. And then this is what I'm going to do with the files after I get home. Those are some things that went into this one.
Okay, so we got a question from Ron. How many shots do you normally use on the R5 in focus stacking?
Uh, I just wrote up a chapter on focus stacking for that Beyond the Ground Landscape ebook that I was talking about. And what I thought would be like a page or two ended up being like 15 pages of information because it's not a straightforward answer. You have to think about things like how steeply is your lens pointed at the subject? How long of a focal length are you using? Because if you're really close to your subject and you're using a very long focal length, you're going to need more files. Are you pointed more straight down at your subject and it's pretty flat? Let's say there's one corner that's a little lower, you might need 2 files. Let's say that you're pointed straight down at your subject, but it has a ton of topography. So maybe a plant with a flower sticking up and then a layer of leaves and then another layer of leaves. If you think of a topographic map having lots of, if you're looking at a mountain, there's a lot of topography with that mountain. So if we apply that same concept to a scene in front of us and we think about that concept of topography, the more topography a scene has, the more files you're going to need. So it's all decisions like that. I would say generally I'm anywhere between 2 files, so really simple, like a foreground and a background, or most of a scene in a corner. So that would be a 2 file type of situation, all the way up to when I was in Death Valley over the last week, photographing salt abstracts, where my lens is pointed very steeply at repeating salt patterns. I was doing 25 files in that kind of situation. A great way to get a sense of how many files you might need is if you have a camera that uses or has the focus peaking setting. you can turn on your focus peaking. And if almost everything is showing as being in focus with the focus peaking, you know that you might only need one file or a few files. If you see that there's like one little tiny band across your scene that's showing up as being in focus, you know you're probably going to need a lot of files. So I think that's probably the single tool that is most helpful if you're just getting started. Use that focus peaking as a handy little cheat sheet for getting a sense of where you might want to start with that number for focus bracketing.
So for a photo like this, were you looking straight down or was this taken at an angle?
Yeah, this was definitely taken at an angle, probably with 100 to 500 millimeter lens. Some of my photos like this are wider scenes, and then some of them, the goal with the focus stack is to really compress, like to make the layers look closer and to get more repetition. So using a 500 millimeter lens pointed steeply at a scene, and then when you render that with focus stacking, what looked like in person, what looked like there was more depth, it gets really compressed. So in this particular case, yeah, I was looking at the scene at a pretty steep angle with probably a longer lens. So there's a little bit of visual trickery for sure. Yes, back to winter photography. This was definitely a
Yeah, let's
cold
talk about
day.
this.
Yeah. This is from, again, Death Valley. I sent you lots of Death Valley photos, I guess, Ian. So there's a beautiful Joshua tree forest at one of the higher elevations in the park. And this, I guess that some of the stuff we were talking about with wildlife photography kind of relates to this because the conditions were changing so quickly. So these bands of fog were moving through, and it was definitely like, oh, this particular tree looks fantastic right now. I need to respond quickly and photograph that tree while the mist is passing through that particular section. And then, oh, this other set of trees, now they look really nice, or there's light coming through in this particular area. I need to move and photograph there. So this was definitely one of those dynamic situations where paying attention and being adaptable was really helpful. But this is also, I find it really hard to compose these scenes. So I actually had photographed this Joshua tree multiple times in the past, and I knew where it was. I knew that I liked the little companion in the left corner. The composition was ready made because I had done this before. The main difference is that I focus stacked this, whereas in the past I hadn't. So my previous version of this scene, which is pink light at twilight, I think, some pink light in the sky. All the bushes in the foreground are soft because this is a little bit of a telephoto scene. So you can't get everything in focus in a single file. So that first time I photographed it, the bushes on the ground are soft. This time, everything is sharp from the bushes to the tree in the background.
Yeah, it's a lovely photo. And Sarah, let's talk about, well, there's some more Death Valley shots. I think definitely we've talked a lot about Death Valley, but I really find this to be a mesmerizing image. I just love all the texture here. This like web of fine detail. Talk more about this.
Well, this one's Death Valley too. So,
Just can't escape Death
um,
Valley.
yeah. I will say that Dune photo that you went by a couple slides ago, that one, the notable thing about that one is that that's 1120 millimeters. So the very long lenses are sometimes really fun for landscapes.
How did you achieve that focal length?
I have an 800 millimeter prime for wildlife and birds, and then I just put a 1.4 teleconverter on it.
Hmm.
So like being a little bit elevated above those sand dunes, and then using that very long lens, you get more compression than you would. And then obviously isolating just a few specific curves. So this is an example of where often I think like landscape photographers sometimes get so they have tunnel vision around like, oh, you use a wide angle lens for this type of scene and you use a telephoto lens for this type of scene. And I think you use every lens for every type of scene is kind of my approach. Like I use that 800 millimeter lens to photograph plants sometimes. So I use my 100 to 500 to photograph plants all the time. I use it to photograph landscapes. I use it to photograph small scenes. I use my wide angle lens to photograph small scenes on the ground. So I think I'm a use every lens for every type of subject person.
Well, so there's a question. What is your favorite lens?
Oh, for sure, the Canon RF 100 to 500 lens. It's so sharp, it's incredibly versatile. I like it so much that I even took it backpacking in Zion National Park a couple of weeks ago, where it's a heavy telephoto lens, and I still was like, I want this. I want to have this on this trip. So it's super versatile. It's great for like the focal range is incredibly handy for all sorts of nature photos, nature photography scenes, and it's also really handy for photographing plants. Uh, because of the close focusing distance, you can look straight down at the ground, and it will still focus at 500 millimeters for somebody my height. So I can put it on my tripod, put it straight down to the ground, and then have a little bit more versatility than you would with a macro lens. So a macro lens would be a fixed focal length, like a 100 millimeter macro. And then if you're out in nature and you don't have a focusing rail or you don't have other tools, it's like kind of a pain to refine a composition. But with the 100 to 500, the magnification is still pretty decent. So I can put it facing straight down to the ground and still be able to focus on a small scene on the ground. So it's just such an incredibly versatile tool.
Is that the lens you used for this photo?
I am not sure. That one could be the 100. I'm guessing I used my macro lens for that one. So that plant is called a prairie clover, and that's another Death Valley special. But I think the important thing with both of the plant photos that you brought up here is that I think probably a lot of people are surprised that this is Death Valley National Park. That if you look closely and you appreciate, if you're one of those people, a lot of people are like, it's so desolate here. Well, it's actually not. If you start paying attention to what's around you, there are plants everywhere. There are even trees in some parts of the park. Like at higher elevations, there are full forests of trees. So I think part of my nature photography practice that I was talking about earlier, that idea of the expansive mindset, is I'm looking for lots of ways to interpret a place. And sometimes that means like I'm going to go to Death Valley and I'm going to photograph desert plants. And when I present them in a portfolio, they're going to potentially be surprising to people because, like this photo and the other photo that you mentioned, the other plant photo, both of these, I think, when people who aren't as familiar with the park look at them, I think they'd be like, oh, I now have another insight into what this landscape consists of. It's not just sand dunes and salt flats, but there are actually some really beautiful plants. And if you look closely, then it's another exciting subject for photography. This would be an example of another focus stack. So on the technical side, it would be really hard to get a scene like this all in focus. This goes back to that topography idea of a lot of the little sections of leaves are sticking up pretty high. So you wouldn't be, if you focused on just one of those, even at something like F16, you wouldn't get the lower level of plants in focus as well. This is another example of going back to the same place because I now have a better version of that one. I just haven't processed it yet.
Well, now I want to see the better version.
Yeah, there's not that rock poking in the on the left side. So, or those the little green plant up in the upper right. So those are two things that I don't like about this particular composition that I found a better specimen and fixed this time around.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's no such thing as a perfect idea or a perfect photo. You can always do better.
So this is one of my I love the scummy ponds. So I'm always every time I pass a scummy pond, I'm looking for photographic opportunities. So this, I think one of the messages here would be looking beyond your initial perception of a subject, and instead of just seeing scummy algae on the surface of a pond, there's beautiful fall colors. There are bands of color. So we have the bands of algae, the bands of pine needles, and then we have all the repeating leaves with the fall colors. So going back to some of the compositional ideas I was talking about earlier, where there are lots of layers of repetition here. But I'm also trying to exclude things. So there were other things happening on the edges of the frame that I'm thinking about wanting to exclude because more context would dilute the message. So I want this just to be about leaves, the algae, the bands of algae, and the kind of the flow from upper right to lower left. So just going back to that idea of repetition, lots and lots of repetition in my compositions.
I want to talk more about, I'm not sure what I want to talk more about. What do you want to talk more about?
I want to hear about your trip to Antarctica before we end.
Okay. Well, why don't we switch over to that a little bit, because this was me trying to channel you, and then we can go back to some more of your photos. And
Okay,
so
that
I
sounds
was
good.
recently down in Antarctica, and this was a fun trip because I've always wanted to go to the seventh continent. But it was also a bit of a challenge for me because there's a lot of new restrictions there, and you can't get as close to the wildlife as you might have been able to a few years ago. There's been avian flu that just like devastated South Georgia Island, and so they're really worried about it getting down to Antarctica. And so I wasn't able to do the wide angle photography that I really like doing. And, it also wasn't really possible for the landscapes because the only time you were able to photograph the landscapes, like at sunrise and sunset, was from the boat. And so there was a lot of telephoto work. There was a lot of restricted work where I couldn't go where I wanted. And there was also a lot of bright light. It was just sunny pretty much all day. And, obviously sunny all day. The days were very long, is what I meant to say.
Mhm.
And so it was a bit of a challenge for me. So I often was asking myself, what would Sarah do? And so, Sarah, I want you to react to some of these photos and let me know if this is the way you might have approached a scene like this. So, for example, I feel this is a very Sarah Marino esque type of composition, zooming in on some distant landscape feature and looking at the texture and the shapes that arise and kind of like, getting it down to just the essential elements. Did I pass the Sarah Marino test on this one?
Yeah, I would say so because even though they're completely different landscapes, Alaska was very similar for us.
Yeah.
Because unlike, or you wouldn't know it from a lot of the photos you see online, where people have taken helicopters into big mountains and then they are close to the big mountains. But if you're exploring a place like Kenai Fjords National Park, where we were photographing from a boat, or you're in a place like Denali or the Denali Highway, the mountains are really far away. So the unless you're there for a really long time and you have a chance to get into the mountains, it's a lot of the same ideas. So from our time on the water, working from a boat, trying to photograph landscapes, yeah, it's the exact same idea
Mhm.
of uh, but I think it does in some ways feel a little bit more static in terms of like not having anything to lead somebody into the frame, uh, and then having kind of just that key message. So the key message here is interesting light on the mountains, which fits very much with my photographic style. But this does feel a little bit different for you because, like, your work from Badlands National Park is a great example
Mhm.
of where you're using really strong lines, like that. It's an immersive type of composition, and this is more. I think it just feels a little bit more removed. So, yes, it passes the San Marino test, but it feels a little bit different than what you do. So I can definitely understand that.
Yeah, yeah. And I like looking for abstract representations of my subjects. And I felt that with the bright light and the fact that there was so much going on, I was having a tough time doing that. But this particular shot is one where I felt like I was getting closer to that ideal that I was looking for, something a bit more abstract. And And so this was probably my favorite shot from the trip, believe it or not.
Well, and this is a good example of how you like the same composition ideas I was talking about with repetition, where you're the shape of the penguin, presumably ice or a mountain behind it, like
Mhm.
that those things are mimicking each other in some way. So it's another completely different way of using the same compositional concept.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's what I was going for. I was looking to isolate a subject, but I was also looking for an interesting background. There was light on the glacier in the background, and there was shadow all around it, and so I felt like I lined it up so that that framed the penguin, and I waited for the penguin to do something interesting. But it was a real challenge, and there was moments when there was some really great light, the epic light that us landscape photographers always love to photograph. But more often than not, I was zooming in, looking for the intimate details and these brief moments where something cool would happen. And it was frustrating me that I was using you were just mentioning how your 100 to 500 is your favorite lens. My favorite lens is my 12 to 24, and so the fact that I was working with a 150 to 500 most of the time, I think this shot here is the only wide angle shot that I took during the entire trip. I think I used
And
that
this
lens
is more
once.
similar to like your work from Greenland. Like, some I would say, like, the same, where or like, this
Mm,
could be very similar to some of your work from the Badlands, where you have those strong lines coming in, the clouds are, doing the same thing, and then you have this very central point of focus with all of the lines around it supporting that idea, pointing you to the interesting iceberg in the middle. So, yeah, this feels definitely like a classic Ian Plant composition.
well, thank you. Though hearing you describe the classic Ian Plant style, you're holding up a mirror to me and forcing me to take a close look to what I do, and I'm realizing, yeah, I'm like a one trick pony.
Oh, I wouldn't say that at all. I think you're a very multiple trick pony.
Yeah, so it was a fun trip, but it was just very, very different from what I'm used to doing. And like with any trip, and we're going to go back to your photos in just a moment. And you can talk more about the images that you've been making in the past few months. But I think you probably would agree that with any photography trip, the first time you go somewhere is probably when you're going to make your worst photos, because it takes a while to understand the rhythm of a place, to immerse yourself in the subject, and to get a feel for what's going to work and what's not going to work. And we talked earlier about this idea of going back and finishing a concept. You're talking about one of your photos saying, this is good, but I now have a better version of it because I worked out some details to make the image stronger. And so I think that I'd like to hear you talk more about that. This idea of taking a concept from your imagination to reality and then trying to perfect the execution. So I imagine like a photograph like this might be you just reacting to what you see. But it might also be something that you're looking for because you've got this idea in your head. So tell me a little bit more about that, and like maybe explain your approach. Are you planning more? Are you thinking ahead, or are you just reacting to things that you're seeing? What is your workflow when you're out there?
Yeah, I think that I have a very layered answer, like many layers building to, I think, maybe a final point. So I think the first point that you made around the first set of images you make in a place are probably your worst. And that's one of the main things that's changed about my photographic approach is when I started in photography, I definitely envisioned myself as more of the world traveler. That here are all the places I want to go, and I would plan to make one trip to each of these places. I certainly would not have expected that I've spent probably a year of my life now in Death Valley. I have spent a lot of time in Zion National Park. I've hiked almost every trail in Zion, photographed very extensively there. And those are things that I would not have expected when I started photographing because I felt like photography, it gets me to the place, I photograph that place, and then I move on. And now I think I much more enjoy the like richness that you get with repeat visits because in my experience, that gives me the freedom to say, I've done the wide angle dune photos before with where I have the big curving line to a peak, and then I have clouds in the sky. Okay, right here. Yeah. So like I've done this, and I have these in my portfolio. So I feel good about them. I feel like they represent this place. But now that I've done those things, I feel like I can instead say, this time I'm going to walk a lot further into the dunes and I'm going to focus on fresh ideas instead of just repeating myself over and over again. And with repeat visits, I feel like then I'm able to give myself permission to say, I'm just going to focus on the interaction of light and shadow on on a little set of ridges, and I'm going to look for multiple implementations of that idea, and then I'm then going to have more diversity in my portfolio. So that's how I get to the example that you had originally asked about, which is the like strong lines, and then like the transition of light on the little small section. Yeah, this section of sand dunes. So this is purely reactive. I was in the right place at the right time. I noticed that these ridges had more definition than I'm used to seeing. It had rained, and because of the rain, there were the sand just had more definition than it had on previous visits. And then I could see the light transitioning off the sand dune. Got myself in position, did another long focus stack, and then also continued repeating that same idea with different patterns that were around me. So on repeat visits, I feel like, yeah, I can spend 4 hours just photographing sand patterns. And through that process, I'm going to have one or two that really stand out. And I thought this one was probably one of the stronger photos that I did that day. So I went out with an idea, but I had no idea what I was going to find. I just knew that I wanted to walk a little further, get to an area that I hadn't been to before, and then see what happened.
Well, I like the way you said that when you first go to an area, you start off maybe getting the obvious shots, you react to what the landscape is giving to you. And then in future visits, you take a deeper view. And, that might have been part of my frustration with my trip to Antarctica was that it was my first time there and it's big, it's bold, it's beautiful. There's lots to photograph. And I was kind of taking the obvious shots. And I call those the foundational shots, like the shots that you want to get in your back pocket. And once you get those, that's when you start asking yourself, how can I be more creative? How can I do something that's a bit more personal? So I felt like in the time I was there, I was shooting other people's shots. I was shooting the stuff that everyone does when they go down there. And I never really had a chance to shoot it Ian Plant style as much as I wanted to. Um, and and so what's really funny to me though is that with this photo, you describe this as being your foundational shot for Death Valley. You're like, well, I got it. I got the wide angle shot. Now it's time to move on to something that's going to be more interesting and better. This is the kind of shot that I feel is what I'm aiming for when I go to a landscape area typically. So it's not my foundational shot. It's the shot that I'm really hoping that I'm going to get. I love this photo. And what I love about it is that the more I look at it, the more I discover about it. So there's the obvious near far compositional juxtaposition. And that's very effectively done, but it's the little details that really enamor me with this photo. In particular, there's this one curving cloud coming down from the upper left that's pointing to the dune that's in the middle of the composition. That little curving cloud coming down perfectly. I mean, those are the convergences that I wait for when I'm doing landscape photography. I would have photographed the scene over and over again, waiting for clouds like this, waiting for that perfect cloud to interact with the landscape. And I would have felt like this was the shot I was aiming for the whole time. And your view is, this is just my boring foundational shot. It's time for me to do something more interesting.
I wouldn't say that. I don't think that I'm trying to communicate that. I think because I have worked for this photo. Like I've
Mhm.
been to these dunes many times. And I've been frustrated at these dunes many times. So I was really happy when this all came together. And so I have two modes of photography, and I'm much more comfortable in one of them. And that's where I arrive at a place, I wander around. So, like, on previous visits to these sand dunes. I never made it to the sand dunes because the rocks on the ground are crazy. Like there are these little mosaics of super colorful rocks as you're walking towards these sand dunes. And I just stopped and photographed those rocks. So it's like because that's what was resonating with me on that day. And then there's the mode of, okay, these clouds are really interesting. I have to find a good foreground to match this cool background. And then I'm going to sit there for the entire sunset, which is what I did that day. And I was consistently pulled to do other things because I don't like staying put. But it was worth staying put because, like you said, that cloud, like that's the moment. And the light was coming in and out of the sand dunes. And at this particular moment, I liked the shadow that was coming from the left side, so that not the entire scene was in more even light. I
Yeah.
liked that there was the little bit of the kind of the ombre with the shadow coming in from the left. And there was a little bit more nuance on the sand dunes themselves and the cloud coming down. So when I'm doing landscape photography, those are the moments where I feel like, okay, everything came together. This was exciting. It was worth sitting and waiting. Like that's why I keep on going outside. So I do
Yeah.
both. I just do the second one a little bit less.
Well, and for that shot, the lighting was so critical because typically overcast skies are not going to be good for sand dunes. You want to have that bright, sunny light on the dunes to get that definition, that light and shadow texture. And so it's rare to have a day where you have, great clouds, but also strong light coming in. So that was a really unique moment, and it's a fantastic photo. So I'm definitely very jealous of this photo. I'm going to give you the highest compliment one photographer can pay to another. I hate your guts for taking this photo.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
But like your subtler scenes though, this is the kind of thing I don't do that often. And I sometimes wonder if I don't do it because I'm just not very good at it. You're very good at it. It comes to you very intuitively. And I have to ask you about this bubble image. So the foam, the sea foam creating these bubbles. I have to wonder if I can take a little bit of credit for this idea because many years ago I did a photo of sea foam bubbles, and I remember you and Ron reacting to it.
Yeah, like it had your reflection like 100,000 times in it,
Right.
if I
It
remember.
was very weird. No, I'm,
Yeah.
I'm just I'm kidding. Of course, this is not a concept that I came up with. And you shot it much better because my reflection in the photo just looked strange. Without the reflection, I think it's much better. But like something like this catches your eye, and it's just an abstract study of colors and textures and shapes. And I just feel like my own eye isn't attuned to these sort of things. So is this and like this photo here is just lovely. It's absolutely lovely. The contrast of the white and the yellow, the snow, and those autumn leaves is really great. And I find myself sort of just not noticing these sorts of scenes, and you definitely are noticing these and executing them quite well. And so I'm wondering if you feel like you've gravitated to this sort of thing because you like it, or if you've gravitated towards it because you're just naturally good at it. So
Yeah,
did
I
you
think
become good because you liked it, or did you like it because you were good at it?
well, I think so the overall theme of this entire conversation, I think, is versatility. And that's one of the reasons I took up the wildlife and bird photography is I wanted to be more versatile. I wanted to be able to, like, if I see an animal in a scene in front of me, I want to know what to do with it. And then I want more diversity in my portfolio. So I think that's a theme that I've been working with for the last couple of years is that I want to have a more diverse portfolio of nature photography. So that sand dune image that we were talking about, the wide angle sand dune photo, I have to work for that. That does not come naturally to me. Those are much harder. And I feel like I have to spend a lot more time working on composition. I just have to put a lot more effort into those scenes. So like the photos that you've been like the bubbles, the ice that we were talking about, this scene, I think I naturally gravitate more towards these because I just love the little details and I like simplifying. I like elevating just a single concept. So I'm better at those. But I want to be more versatile. So I'm trying to do more of things that are less comfortable for me.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea. I think that's something that everyone needs to do. I definitely need to do more of it myself. So that means I'm going to have to go back to Antarctica because it kicked my butt, and I need a rematch. Um, and I always encourage people. I mentioned this in the beginning to cross over, try something that you haven't done before, something that you're not very comfortable with, because it's how you push your artistic boundaries. Years ago, I on a lark, I decided to start doing street photography. And it was really just a hobby. I realized I didn't have a hobby because photography
Mhm.
is all consuming, right? So I'm like, well, in my spare time when I'm home and not traveling, you were talking earlier about being this jet setting photographer. When I'm not doing that, maybe I'll just focus on what is near me, and what's near me is the city of Minneapolis. So let's do street photography. What the heck? Great hobby. Um, and it was a strange adventure for me because I'm uncomfortable about photographing people. I feel like I'm stealing something from them. I'm stealing their soul by taking their picture when they're going about their daily lives. But it was exhilarating artistically. It really helped me think differently about the way I photograph landscapes and wildlife and anything else that I'm photographing. So it made me a better artist. And even though I've kind of wrapped that project up and I'm not really doing that sort of stuff anymore, it really has lived with me and it carries over into my other work. So I'm glad to hear you talk about exploring new artistic avenues. I'm excited to see what you come up with. I want to see more of your wildlife photography. I'm hoping you're going to do plenty more. And I can't wait to see where this takes you. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It was great. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. We will definitely have you on again sometime soon. So, everyone, thank you so much. And we'll catch you next time on Photomasters Live. Bye bye.